The Forgotten Voyage. When Vikings discovered America. A tale of ice, blood, and the New World. The wind howled across the gray waters of the North Atlantic like a beast denied its prey. It was the kind of wind that could strip the flesh from a man's bones, that could turn a brave heart cold, that could make even the most seasoned sailor question whether the gods themselves had cursed his journey. But Eric Thorvaldsen, known to all as Eric the Red for the fierce color of his hair and the equally fierce temper that burned within him, had never been one to bow before the gods or men. It was the year 982, and Eric was running. Again, but this was not the first time blood had stained his hands, nor the first time exile had driven him from his home. His father, Thorvald Asvaldsen, had fled Norway years before after killing a man in a fight, dragging young Eric with him to the harsh volcanic shores of Iceland. There, in the unforgiving north, Eric had carved out a life. He had married Thjodild, a woman as strong as the land itself, and they had built a farm in the shadow of ice-capped mountains. But Eric's temper, that terrible red rage, had betrayed him once more. A dispute with a neighbor over a landslide, dead thralls, vengeance taken, blood spilled, and now, exile. 3 years. That was his sentence. 3 years banished from Iceland, cast out like a wolf from the pack. But Eric the Red was not a man to waste time in regret. While lesser men would have hidden in shame, Eric set his sights on a new horizon. He had heard whispers of a land to the west, spotted years before by a sailor named Gunnbjörn, a land shrouded in mystery and ice. And so, with his family and a handful of loyal followers, Eric turned his longship westward and sailed into the unknown. What he found changed everything. The land was vast, impossibly vast, ringed by towering glaciers that gleamed like the gates of Valhalla itself. But as Eric sailed around the southern tip of this frozen giant, he discovered something remarkable. Deep fjords carved into the western coast, and within them, valleys of the most astonishing green. Here, sheltered from the ice, grass grew thick and lush. Here, sheep could graze. Here, men could live. Eric spent 3 long years exploring this strange new world. He claimed the best land for himself, near a fjord he would name Eriksfjord, and there he established his estate. Bratahlid, the steep slope. When his exile ended and he returned to Iceland in 985, he came bearing tales of this wondrous place. But Eric was clever. He knew that no one would follow him to a land called Iceland II. So he gave it a name that would sing in men's ears, that would kindle their imaginations, that would make them dream of prosperity and new beginnings. He called it Greenland. The gamble worked. That same summer, 25 ships carrying some 400 settlers departed Iceland, bound for Eric's Greenland. The journey was brutal. 11 ships were lost to storms, their crews swallowed by the hungry sea. But 14 ships reached the fjords, and the Norse settlement of Greenland was born. 2 communities took root on the southwest coast, the eastern settlement near modern-day Kokkortok, where Eric ruled from Bratahlid, and the western settlement far to the north. But this is not Eric's story alone. For among his children was a son who would eclipse even his father's legend. A son whose name would be whispered in saga and song for 1,000 years. A son who would be the first European to set foot on the shores of a new world. His name was Leif. The son of the Red Leif Erikson was everything his father was, and yet something more. Where Eric was fire and fury, Leif was thoughtful, calculating. Where Eric made enemies, Leif made alliances. He was tall and strong, with the bearing of a natural leader, and he possessed a quality rare among Vikings: wisdom. Around the year 999, when Leif was a young man, he sailed from Greenland to Norway to serve at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason. The journey itself became an adventure. Blown off course by storms, Leif found himself stranded in the Hebrides, those windswept islands off the coast of Scotland. There he spent a summer, and there he fell in love with a noblewoman named Thorgunna. When autumn came and favorable winds returned, Leif prepared to continue to Norway. Thorgunna begged him to take her with him, but Leif, bound by honor and protocol, refused to do so without her family's permission. She remained behind, pregnant with his son. The boy, Thorgils, would eventually be sent to Leif in Greenland, though he would never truly belong. In Norway, at the court of King Olaf, Leif's life changed forever. The king was a zealous Christian, a man who saw it as his sacred duty to spread the faith of the White Christ across the northern world. Iceland, the Orkneys, the Shetlands, the Faroes, all had bent the knee and accepted baptism. Now Olaf set his sights on Greenland. He chose Leif Erikson as his instrument. Leif accepted conversion, perhaps out of genuine belief, perhaps out of political necessity, perhaps out of both. The king commissioned him to return to Greenland with priests and clerics to bring the gospel to his father's distant colony. In the year 1000, Leif set sail for home, his ship laden not with trade goods, but with the promise of a new god. But the North Atlantic, that cruel mistress, had other plans. Storms drove Leif's ship far off course, west of Greenland, to a place no Norse sailor had deliberately sought. When the skies finally cleared and land appeared on the horizon, Leif and his crew found themselves staring at shores entirely unknown. This was not the ice and rock of Greenland. This was a land of deep forests and abundant wildlife. The very air felt different, warmer, richer, alive with possibilities. Yet Leif's mission was to Greenland, not to explore strange coasts. After rescuing 15 shipwrecked sailors, he found stranded on the shore, earning him the nickname Leif the Lucky. He continued eastward and finally reached Greenland. But the memory of that forested land stayed with him, a seed planted deep in his mind. When Leif arrived at Brattahlid, he found his father aged and weary. Eric the Red listened to his son's preaching of the new faith with cold silence. The old man would not abandon the gods of his fathers, not Thor nor Odin, not for any king's command. But Theodild, Leif's mother, embraced Christianity with fervor. She had a church built, a small, simple structure that would become known as Theodild's Church, and after her conversion, she refused to share her bed with Eric until he too accepted baptism. The saga tells us that this annoyed Eric greatly. But while father and son clashed over religion, Leif's mind kept returning to that mysterious land he had glimpsed. And he was not the only one thinking of lands to the west. For there was another story circulating through Greenland, a story that would change the course of history. The merchant who wouldn't land, his name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, and he had seen the New World first. In the summer of 986, the very year Eric the Red led his settlers to Greenland, Bjarni arrived in Iceland from Norway, as was his custom. He was a merchant and ship captain, a man who spent his winters with his father in Iceland and his summers trading in Scandinavia. But when Bjarni's ship docked that year, he learned startling news. His father, Herjolfr, had abandoned the family farm and sailed west with Eric the Red to settle in Greenland. Most men would have cursed their luck and settled in for the winter. Not Bjarni. Without hesitation, he ordered his crew to set sail immediately for Greenland, even though none of them had ever been there, even though they possessed neither map nor reliable directions. It was an act of either great love or great foolishness, perhaps both. For 3 days they sailed westward until fog and contrary winds engulfed them. For days more they drifted blind through gray seas, with no sun to guide them, no stars to steer by. When the fog finally lifted, they found land, but it was not the land they sought. The shore before them was covered in thick forests, with low rolling hills stretching inland. Bjarni's crew begged him to go ashore, to explore, to replenish their supplies. But Bjarni refused. This was not Greenland. Eric the Red's new colony was supposed to be dominated by glaciers and ice. This forested land could not be their destination. So they turned north and sailed on. 2 days later, they sighted land again. This second shore was flatter, also heavily wooded. Again, the crew pleaded to land. Again, Bjarni refused and ordered them north. 3 more days of sailing brought them to a third land, this one mountainous and covered in glaciers. But still, Bjarni insisted, not matching the descriptions of Greenland. With his crew on the verge of mutiny, Bjarni turned east, and 4 days later, by a stroke of extraordinary fortune, they made landfall at Herjolfsnes, precisely where his father had built his new home. Bjarni had accomplished the impossible, sailing blind to an unknown destination and arriving exactly where he intended. But in doing so, he had also become the first European to sight the shores of North America. He simply hadn't known it and hadn't cared to find out. When Bjarni told his story in Greenland, some mocked him for his lack of curiosity. Others listened with keen interest. Among those who listened most carefully was Leif Erikson, the land of wine. Around the year 1000, Leif could wait no longer. He went to Bjarni and bought his ship, the very vessel that had glimpsed the New World 14 years before. He assembled a crew of 35 men, strong and brave, and he invited his father, Eric the Red, to lead the expedition. Eric was old now, but he still commanded respect. His luck, his leadership, his very presence would be an asset. Eric reluctantly agreed, but as the old Viking rode his horse down to the shore on the day of departure, the animal stumbled and Eric was thrown to the ground. He took it as an omen, a sign from the gods, or from the White Christ, that he should not make this journey. Eric turned back and Leif sailed without him. Eric the Red would never see the New World. His son would claim that glory alone. Leif and his crew retraced Bjarni's route in reverse. First, they came to a land of flat stones and glaciers, a barren, lifeless place that offered nothing but desolation. Leif named it Helleland, the land of flat stones. Scholars today believe this was Baffin Island, far in the Canadian Arctic. Sailing south, they reached a second land, heavily forested with white sandy beaches. Here there was timber in abundance, great trees perfect for shipbuilding. Leif called it Markland, the land of forests, likely the coast of Labrador. But it was the third land that took their breath away. Continuing south, they reached a place unlike anything they had ever known. The climate was mild, so mild that grass remained green even in winter. Rivers teemed with salmon, larger than any in Norway or Iceland. The forests were rich with game. And most wondrous of all, growing wild in the woods, they found grapevines heavy with fruit, or perhaps wild berries that could be fermented into wine. Leif Erikson, standing on that alien shore with his men around him, gave this paradise a name that would echo through the centuries. Vinland, the land of wine. They built a camp, large timber and turf houses in the Norse style, with long halls and storage rooms. They called it Leifsbudir, Leif's camp. Here they spent the winter, fishing and hunting, exploring the surrounding lands. The days were longer here than in Greenland, the climate kinder, the resources boundless. It seemed a land where men could not only survive, but thrive. When spring came, Leif loaded his ship with timber and samples of wild grapes and sailed back to Greenland. He arrived to great fanfare, and his tales of Vinland spread like wildfire through the settlements. A new world, a land of plenty, a place where ambitious men could make their fortunes. But Leif the Lucky, as he was now called, would never return to Vinland. His responsibilities in Greenland kept him home. Instead, it would be his younger brother Thorvald who would write the next chapter and pay the ultimate price. The arrow in the dark Thorvald Eriksson had listened to his brother's tales of Vinland with growing hunger. Where life saw opportunity, Thorvald saw destiny. In 1002, he borrowed Leif's ship, assembled a crew of 30 men, and set sail for the west. They followed Leif's route easily, found the camp at Leifsbudir intact, and settled in for a long exploration of this new land. For 2 years, Thorvald and his men explored the coastlines of Vinland. They sailed west along wooded shores, navigating rivers and bays, mapping the land, claiming it in their hearts, if not in law. The country was beautiful beyond words, rich beyond imagining. One day, exploring a forested headland, Thorvald stood gazing at the landscape and said to his men, "Here is beautiful. Here I would like to make my dwelling." He did not know how prophetic those words would be. As they sailed further, the Norsemen came upon something unexpected. 3 small boats made of animal hide overturned on a beach. Curious and cautious, they approached and discovered 9 men sleeping beneath the boats. Natives of this land, people the Norse would come to call Skraelings, a term that might mean barbarians or screechers. What happened next is recorded plainly in the sagas, without justification or explanation. The Norsemen killed 8 of the 9 men on sight. Only one escaped, fleeing into the forest. It was a brutal, perhaps thoughtless act, one that would haunt the Norse presence in Vinland forever. The survivor raised the alarm. Soon, a great flotilla of hide boats appeared, filled with armed warriors seeking vengeance for their slain kinsmen. The Skraelings attacked the Norse ship with bows and slings, launching a storm of projectiles. The Vikings, though better armed and armored, found themselves fighting desperately to repel the assault. Then, in the chaos of battle, Thorvald Eriksson gave a cry and fell. An arrow had found its mark, piercing him under the arm, slipping past his guard into his flesh. As his men fought on, driving the attackers back, Thorvald pulled the arrow from his body and knew immediately that the wound was mortal. With his last breaths, he gave his men final instructions. They were to bury him on that beautiful headland where he had hoped to build his home. They were to place a cross at his head and another at his feet, and they were to call the place Crossenes, Cross Point. Thorvald Eriksson became the first European to die in the New World, killed by the very people whose land he had come to claim. His men buried him as he had asked, then fled Vinland, sailing back to Greenland with news of both wonder and tragedy. A third brother, Thorstein, attempted to reach Vinland the following year to retrieve Thorvald's body, but storms drove him back. Thorvald's bones would remain forever in the American soil. But if the Vikings had hoped the death of Thorvald would teach them caution, they were mistaken. The story of Vinland only grew more compelling, and the most ambitious expedition was yet to come, the settlement that failed. His name was Thorfinn Karlsefni, and he was not a warrior seeking glory, but a merchant seeking fortune. The nickname Karlsefni means the makings of a man, or a man of real worth, and he would need every bit of that worth in the years to come. Thorfinn arrived in Greenland around 1003 as a wealthy Icelandic trader. At Brattahlid, he met and fell in love with Gudrid Thorbjarnadottir, the widow of Thorstein Eriksson, Leif's third brother who had died attempting to reach Finland. Gudrid was no ordinary woman. She was wise, strong, and some said she possessed the gift of prophecy. She had survived shipwreck, plague, and the death of her husband. She was a survivor, When Gudrid spoke to Thorfinn about Vinland, about the possibilities that land represented, he listened, and when she agreed to join him on an expedition, he knew they would succeed where others had failed. This would not be a mere exploration. This would be colonization. In the year 1010, or perhaps 1009, the sagas disagree, Thorfinn Karlsefni assembled the largest Norse expedition yet to the New World. 3 ships carrying between 60 and 140 settlers departed Greenland. Men, women, livestock, tools, everything needed to establish a permanent settlement. This was to be a true colony, self-sufficient and enduring. They followed Leif's route, past Helluland stones, past Markland's forests, until they reached the green shores of Vinland. They settled near Leifsbudir, or perhaps in a location further south near a tidal estuary the sagas call Hop. They built longhouses of timber and turf. They planted crops. They hunted and fished. And in Vinland, Gudrid gave birth to a son. They named him Snorri Thorfinnsson, and he became the first child of European descent born in the Americas. For a time, the settlement thrived. The Norsemen explored further south than any had ventured before, finding butternuts and butternut wood, trees whose natural range extended only as far north as New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. This meant the Vikings had traveled at least as far south as the Gulf of St. Lawrence, perhaps even further. Then the Skraelings came. At first, contact was peaceful. The natives approached cautiously, and trade began. Norse cloth and dairy products for valuable furs. The Skraelings seemed fascinated by the red cloth the Norse offered, and they were astounded by the Vikings' cattle, animals they had never seen before. But the peace was fragile, built on mutual misunderstanding and tentative trust. Then a Norse bull broke loose. The great beast charged toward the Skraelings, bellowing and wild-eyed. The natives fled in terror, believing they were under attack. They disappeared into the forest, and for 3 weeks there was silence. When they returned, they came in force, not to trade, but to fight. The battle was fierce and chaotic. The Skraelings attacked with bows, slings, and hit-and-run tactics, using their knowledge of the terrain to deadly effect. The Norse, though heavily armed and armored, found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They fought desperately, retreating to a defensive position inland from their camp. And then, in the midst of the battle, a pregnant woman stepped forward and changed everything. Her name was Freydis Eiriksdottir. She was the daughter of Eric the Red, sister to Leif and Thorvald, and she was as fierce as any warrior in the settlement. 8 months pregnant, she watched as the Norse line began to buckle under the Skraeling assault. And something inside her snapped. Freydis seized a sword from a fallen companion. She tore open her dress, baring her pregnant belly and breasts, and then, beating the flat of the blade against her bare chest, she let out a terrifying war cry, a scream of defiance and rage that froze both friend and foe in their tracks. The Skraelings, who had never seen anything like this mad pregnant warrior woman, faltered. Fear rippled through their ranks, and in that moment of hesitation, the Norse rallied. The Skraelings retreated, disappearing once more into the forests. Freydis had saved the settlement, but everyone knew the victory was temporary. Thorfinn Karlsefni called a council. The reality was inescapable. The Skraelings vastly outnumbered them. More attacks would come. The natives knew the land, knew how to fight in these forests. The Norse did not. Unlike Greenland and Iceland, where they had encountered no significant hostile populations, Vinland was already home to a people who would not surrender their territory. The decision was made. After 3 years of trying to build a new life in the New World, the settlers packed their belongings, loaded their ships, and abandoned Vinland forever. Thorfinn and Gudrid sailed back to Greenland, then eventually to Iceland, where they lived out their days. Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European born in America, grew up in Iceland and never returned to the land of his birth. He became a Christian leader and founded a great lineage, but the New World remained only a story to him, a legend of his earliest days. The last voyage, but Freydis, Eric's daughter, was not finished with Vinland. The sagas tell two versions of Freydis' story, and in one of them, her name is forever blackened with blood. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis led her own expedition to Vinland in partnership with two Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi. But from the beginning, the partnership was poisoned by rivalry and greed. When they arrived in Vinland, a dispute arose over the houses at Leifsbudir. By tradition, those who arrived first had the right to choose the best dwellings. The brothers arrived before Freydis and claimed Leif's original buildings. Freydis was furious. She confronted them, demanded they leave, cited her brother Leif's authority. They refused, standing on their rights. So Freydis decided to take what she wanted. One winter night, she went to her husband and lied, claiming the brothers had beaten her and insulted her honor. Enraged, her husband and men stormed the brothers' hall and dragged out every man, binding them. At Freydis' command, they were executed one by one, but when it came to the women and children who had come with the brothers, Freydis' own men refused to kill them. Freydis took up an axe and did it herself. When spring came, the survivors loaded their ship and sailed back to Greenland. Freydis tried to keep the murders secret, threatening anyone who spoke of it. But word spread. When Leif Erikson learned what his sister had done, he was horrified. Yet she was his blood, the daughter of Eric the Red, and he could not bring himself to execute her. Instead, he cursed her name, and the saga tells us that no one thought well of Freydis or her descendants after that. Whether this dark tale is true or merely saga invention, we cannot know, but it marks the end of the Viking presence in Vinland. No more expeditions were launched. The dream of a Norse America died, and within a few generations the very location of Vinland faded into myth. For 900 years, scholars debated, had the Vikings really reached America? Were the sagas truth or fantasy? Some believed, most scoffed. The tales seemed too incredible, too fantastical. Surely they were nothing more than legends. Then in 1960, everything changed. The proof a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, had spent years searching the coastlines of North America for evidence of Norse settlement. They followed clues from the sagas, studied maps, and sailed the routes the Vikings would have taken. And in a remote corner of Newfoundland, at the very northern tip of the island, a local fisherman named George Decker led them to a field of overgrown ridges and mounds near a place called Lance aux Meadows. The Ingstads excavated for 8 years, from 1961 to 1968, and what they found stunned the world. 8 buildings constructed of turf and timber in the classic Norse style, 3 large halls, 4 workshops, and a forge, identical to structures found in Iceland and Greenland from exactly the same period. Spindle whorls for weaving, a bronze ring-headed cloak pin of distinctly Norse design, fragments of iron boat nails, slag from a bloomery furnace where iron had been smelted from bog ore, the first iron production in all of North America. And in 2021, scientists announced the most precise date yet. By analyzing tree rings in wooden artifacts and matching them to a known solar storm in the year 1021, they determined that Vikings were cutting down trees at Lance aux Meadows in exactly that year, precisely 1,000 years ago. The sagas were true. Lance aux Meadows was Leifsbudir, or if not the exact site, then somewhere very nearby. The Vikings had been here. They had built houses, repaired ships, smelted iron, woven cloth. Women had been present. The spindle whorls proved it. This was not a war camp, but a true settlement, a base for further exploration. And then they had left, abandoning it all, leaving only ghosts and grass-covered ruins. Vikings walked on American soil 1,000 years ago, then vanished, leaving only subtle traces to be rediscovered by science and story. Their brief adventure changed the world's history, proving we all live amidst forgotten voyages. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of today's journey. If you believe that history deserves to be told with integrity, join our fellowship by hitting the subscribe button. Every like helps this story reach more listeners gathered around their fires. Don't set your armor aside for long. Next week, the rise of the Knights Templar awaits us. I'll be waiting for you at the usual place.